Hi everybody, Adam Steele here. It's 3:30 in the morning, and I heard the news a few hours ago that one of my heroes is no longer with us, and that's Mr. Neil Peart from Rush, the drummer and lyricist. And it's affected me enough that at 3:30 in the morning, as soon as I got home, I felt like I needed to make some sort of video about it to talk about my, I guess, tribute to the man, because he meant a great deal to me in a lot of strangely connected ways. So yeah, this is going to be quite a personal video. So here's a news article from the BBC. So this is, in some ways, as far as the public is concerned, typical Neil Peart. That he had apparently been privately battling brain cancer for the past 3.5 years. But even as a dedicated Rush fan, I couldn't have told you that, because yeah, he was an intensely private man, and all the more power to him for being a well-known celebrity musician in many ways, and still being able to be so private about something this big. I suppose he just didn't want to have to go through the celebrity rigmarole of having to suddenly, stand up for something or even be in the spotlight in any kind of way. And yeah, and even more telling as to the man's privateness. Apparently he passed away on Tuesday, and it's now Friday, and it's only now that we're all beginning to find out. So yeah, I mean, this is absolutely terrible news in one way, but as much as it's a shock to the general public, I suppose it's just one of those things. If he's been fighting this, again, privately for 3.5 years, that's a lot. And so the BBC have given a very short kind of detail of his career in Rush. And yeah, to me, Neil was so much more, despite the fact that he was one of only 3 members of quite possibly my favourite band ever. And as a professional musician, your favourite band should be a fairly important thing to you, which should go some way to explaining how important what he did was to me. I mean, I'm in my mid-30s now, and whenever I'm out doing anything public, I find that if I'm listening to music, you'll see me air drumming. You'll see me doing, I constantly do the tick, 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 and I've been doing that all my life. And I've been doing it mostly because of the interesting drumming that Neil Peart did. When I was younger, I quite often would be ridiculed for that, and I never ever felt bad for it, never felt shamed, because to be inspired to that level by what one person does is quite frankly astonishing. I mean, there are other musicians that I listen to and enjoy, but not in the same way. And Rush have always been important to me, and I don't just mean that in a kind of a cliche way. I was born into a Rush family. My dad has been a huge Rush fan for as long as I can remember, but I was always given the choice as a kid to listen to what I wanted and that kind of thing, but I felt myself drawn in to what these guys were doing. I think it was 5 years old, or maybe even younger. I had the VHS video cassette of A Show of Hands, which was the Rush live at Birmingham NEC concert. And apparently I wore that tape out because I would constantly watch it on loop as a 5-year-old child. And I distinctly remember the drum solo from that, the rhythm method, being absolutely inspiring, and watching that over and over and over. And as someone who didn't end up as a career drummer, that's all the weirder. Because it turns out that what I actually wanted to do musically was more vocal and bass. I ended up, musically speaking, wanting to be more like Geddy Lee. But from an intellectual standpoint, that's the other inspiration that I found. That Neil Peart was a very gifted and prolific lyricist that wrote words that were more than just ooh baby baby yeah yeah, and he would make me stop and think all the time on anything that he wrote in any period of their career. And that's something that's almost priceless in itself, because as a distinctly educated, eloquent Englishman, to be into rock and roll and still be able to use words like soliloquy in writing, that was a big thing for me. That was a big pull. And that's probably why I listen to bands that I listen to now, like Porcupine Tree, for example, with Stephen Wilson, who writes very eloquently, and the Decemberists, who also write very well and very in interesting ways. And I suppose the thing is that not only was Neil Peart one of my heroes growing up, but when I started to find my own bands and started to find musicians that I looked up to that were more closer to my age, even if not necessarily my age, it turns out most of my heroes had Neil Peart as their heroes. It's like Mike Portnoy from Dream Theater, huge Rush fan. Taylor Hawkins from the Foo Fighters, huge Rush fan. And Coheed and Cambria, I was a massive fan of as a teenager, massive Rush fans. And they will enthuse at length, far more than I can, about the influence that Neil and the other guys in Rush had on them. But that trickle-down effect has been so pervasive throughout everything that I've done, that all the bands that I've listened to and gone, I want to be like these guys, it turns out were all bands that wanted to be like Neil and Geddy and Alex. And that dedication to craft has just been a big part of what makes my life, even in terms of being a producer and looking at other people's work. I tend to find angles that the bands would not necessarily have thought of, and a lot of that is to do with the way that I was brought up musically. And it's a huge thing. I mean, another distinct parallel is a very personal tale, is that Rush were one of the first bands to be able to truly move me, not just musically but lyrically, of course. A story that I don't tell very often is that when I was about 7 years old, I sat down with a vinyl copy of 2112 and read the lyrics and had it explained to me as it went. And I remember being in floods of tears at the end, because someone being able to tell an entire deep emotional story of discovery and loss and revolution in the time of an 18-minute side of vinyl, that's incredible. That's something that, generally speaking, is reserved for well-crafted film. And musically, I've heard other works that long or longer I was quite a fan of Yes as a kid, but a lot of their lyrics were gibberish. They could be quite inspiring in an abstract way, but I also found bands where a 3 or 4 minute song could make you sit down and think, but nothing like this, where an entire story, start to finish, could be so profound. And so I also remember another story of mine. When I was 10, I went on a school trip. I live in the UK, and we went to Holland, and there was a talent competition. And this is before I'd played any kind of instrument at any kind of level. And I remember I had my cassette Walkman with me. This was 1996. And my entry into the talent competition is I remember I played air drums and air guitar to a Rush song. And I remember everyone else kind of laughing, but look at me now. And that's how much this band was inspiring me. I remember the song was Big Money from the Power Windows album. And I really distinctly remember going back and listening to Big Money and then the version from A Show of Hands, and listening as a 10-year-old that couldn't play drums to the intricacies of all the snare fills at the end of that song and how cool that was. And again, just to reiterate, I didn't sit down as a determined, I am going to be a drummer until another 10 years after that fact. But that I was excited musically to learn how he'd done that as a non-musician. So when I started to find my musical feet years later, it's no surprise that I would end up playing a lot of Rush, because not only was it technically good, I mean, I listened to other technical drummers, but it was musically interesting to boot. And here's a man who, around the time that I was air guitaring and air drumming to Rush, had a serious downturn in his life, where he lost his daughter and his wife within the same year. And around that same time, he'd completely relearned how to play drums. I mean, this is a man at the peak of his ability as far as most of the world would be concerned. And he decided it wasn't enough and went and completely relearned. And then this tragedy happened. And after a long time of soul searching and all that kind of cliched stuff, he came back and was then a prolific writer as well, a novelist. He wrote several novels, which I, to my shame, have not read yet. Apart from the one where he cycled around Africa, I found that one was absolutely hilarious. That was his first novel. But the rest of them are sat on a bookcase somewhere at my dad's house, and I'm definitely now going to try and take the time to read them and digest them and try and get to know a bit more about the man. Because there was a part of me that thought, you know what, now that Rush have retired, the reasons were given that these guys were getting a bit older and that they weren't quite the musicians in terms of one of them had really bad joint pain. Neil was apparently touring would absolutely take it all out of him, which, again, the explanation that someone like Charlie Watts from the Rolling Stones could keep going till he was 80 because of what he played, but Neil Peart couldn't keep going because of what he was playing night after night. And I completely understood that. But maybe now, with hindsight, did he know already when Rush retired that something wasn't right and that this was going to happen? I can't remember now the exact kind of date when they stopped touring, but was it a coincidence? Was this something that he was aware of and said, okay, well, this is going to happen. I want to go out on a high. Which he most certainly did, because they finished the end of the last tour that they did triumphantly. And so this is going to put a whole new spin on the last DVD that was made of them, called Time Stands Still, which was a retrospective of the end of the band. And generally speaking, I don't think this is going to paint Neil in much of a different light for me, because he was already a huge hero of mine. And so for me, this is going to be going back and revisiting some fond memories. But just to sign this off, I'm going to be in the studio filming tomorrow. I'm going to be up quite early, but I'm probably going to get behind my kit, which is set up, and spend half an hour playing along to drums from Rush songs. And I'll be very surprised if I'm not in absolute tears by the end of it. So that's all from me for today. Thank you, Neil Peart, for everything. Thank you, everyone, for watching. And hopefully it'll be a lighter note when I see you in the next video. So thanks, everybody. Neil Peart, rest in peace. Good night.